A new comet has been spotted high in the heavens. On July 22nd of this year, it was spotted in Sagittarius, the constellation. And it is appearing to be the brightest thing that man has ever seen in the sky. It is due to come into our immediate vicinity sometime around April of 1997. Gary Stearman has the story on the Hale-Bopp Comet.
Hale-Bopp, kind of a strange name, but name for two men. One of the gentlemen is named Alan Hale, and the other is Thomas Bopp. And on July 22nd, J.R., they spotted the comet. Amateur astronomers. Hale was viewing the globular cluster M70 in Sagittarius, happened to have his home telescope pointed in that direction and saw a fuzzy little globule in his field of view. And the same night, Mr. Bopp was watching the same area with his home telescope. Two amateur astronomers spotted this comet, so it's named for both of them. Now, here's the interesting thing. When they first spotted this comet, it was out beyond the orbit of Jupiter. This is astonishing. For amateur astronomers to be able to see a comet that far away. Immediately, people began to look at this thing, and they decided this had to be an extraordinary comet. And in fact, various writers in the field of astronomy have been saying that this may rival the brightest comet of our modern era, namely the Great Comet of 1811. The Great Comet of 1811 had a tail 70 degrees long. That is, if you looked up in the sky, it covered 70 degrees of sky, and it hung there for quite a while, many days. And the actual length of that tail was 1 AU, which is 93 million miles.
Wow.
Now that's a long-tailed comet.
That's incredible.
And get this. Sky and Telescope magazine reporting in their edition, let me see here, this is the October 1995 edition, says this: from the comet's nuclear brightness, Ignacio Ferrin of the University of the Andes in Venezuela hypothesizes that its core may span some 100 to 150 kilometers. That's 5 to 10 times larger than Halley's Comet, and he estimates that the comet could reach magnitude -1 in late March 1997. Now, it would grow after that. In other words, it would grow to -1 by late March, but it would stay bright for as long as 6 weeks. Now, this is amazing to consider, because comets have always been considered the precursors or the messengers of change in history.
Yes.
They seem to foreshadow political changes of great magnitude, such as, for example, the Great Battle of 1066, the Norman Conquest, the Great War of 1812, which was preceded, as you just noted, by the Great Comet of 1811. And so, and this goes back into distant history, the idea that comets presage great world changes.
That's 100 to 150 kilometers there. Would be somewhere between 60 and 90 miles. In just, what, the width of the core?
Just the core itself. Which
this is a humongous comet.
Absolutely. It's practically unprecedented in the modern era.
Now, being 10 times bigger than Halley's Comet means that for 1 mile across Halley's Comet, it's 10 miles across.
Right. Yeah.
This is not doubling, but this is 10 times. That's a phenomenal brightness there.
It is a phenomenal brightness, and astronomers are a little bit reluctant, as you can imagine. They've predicted a few bright comets that turned out to be duds, and so they don't want to get too excited about it. But this comet seems to be in a league by itself, J.R.
But already the brightness of this comet is brighter than most comets when they make their perihelion behind the sun.
Very bright. It still cannot be seen with the naked eye, but it's extremely bright. And by the way, it is coming in at an orbit that is perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic, which means that it would be very high in the sky and extremely viewable. It's not going to be like down near the sun at sunset, so that it would be lost in the sun's glow. It would be up high in the sky. So this thing promises to be quite a sight.
Listen to what happened in the years before the destruction of the Jewish temple. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, writes about it. He says, "Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year." In fact, he mentioned that on the 8th day of Nisan, this was around 66 AD, just a few years before, just before the Jews' rebellion that led eventually to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. On the 8th day of Nisan, that would be just about a week before Passover, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone, this would be 3 a.m., I guess. So great a light shone round the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. And of course, at the same festival, the Passover festival, that's when the heifer gave birth to a lamb in the temple courtyard.
Now, we're talking about the period of the destruction of the Second Temple.
Yes.
Horrendous days for the Jews. This was the beginning of their great diaspora, which has lasted almost 2,000 years. And again, comets have been thought throughout history to presage great world changes. Now, all the time this comet was appearing in the skies, Titus and Vespasian and the armies of Rome were surrounding the temple, besieging the temple. And they, of course, laid a very long siege to Jerusalem. And they were looking up in the sky and seeing the same comet and maybe thinking to themselves, the gods are on our side. You know, here's our comet. It means that we're going to be able to be successful in this war after all. But the point is, when those comets come, people shake and fear and tremble with fear.
In the ancient past.
In the ancient past.
It's amazing to me that this one came about 3 years before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and this one's coming in 1997, about 3 years before the turn of the century. Listen to Psalm 97, which says, "Clouds and darkness around about him, righteousness and judgment of the habitation of his throne, a fire goeth before him." That'd be a comet, Gary.
And listen, it could be a comet. And I want to mention, for those of you who are not familiar with J.R. Church's book, Hidden Prophecies in the Psalms, J.R., back in 1986, and before that, by the way, began to develop the idea that the Psalms tell the history of modern Israel year by year by year in the 20th century, and the number of the psalm corresponds with the number of the year. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, it sounds strange, but it has been verified. It has been confirmed. We have seen it work over and over again. And J.R., what amazing coincidence, quote unquote, that here in 97, we have a fire and his lightning's enlightening the world, and at the very same time we're predicting perhaps the biggest comet in the last 150, 200 years.
Yeah, verse 9 says, "Thou art high above all the earth." So here's this bright light up there above the earth. And Psalm 97 has what appears to be an absolute reference to it. Listen to verse 11. "Light is sown for the righteous."
Wow.
This light, Gary, let's discuss it. It's the Hebrew word or.
And we're talking about light here in the same sense as the light back in Genesis chapter 1, where God said, "Let there be light." Now this light is thought by many commentators and by the sages of Israel down through the years to be the light of God. In other words, it's not light that comes from any given planet or star or sun or moon or reflected light, but rather is the pure light of God. And J.R., in this verse 11 of Psalm 97, light is sown for the righteous. The word to sow here is the very same word you use to sow seed. You imagine taking a handful of seed and taking some seed out and broadcasting it on the ground. This is the very same idea here as light being sown for the righteous. God taking perhaps a handful of light and scattering it out. Now, what does that mean to you? It's a strange symbol.
Well, you know, when you see a comet in the sky, there's that head of the comet, and then it looks like light being cast out
from it
in its tail. To me, this sounds like a comet.
It could very well be. Now, J.R., this is amazing, because 3 years before AD 70, the great comet appeared over the Middle East, right, over the whole world, and was prominent in the Middle East.
Yeah.
3 years before the turn of the millennium.
We're not talking about any small comet here.
No.
Gary, could it come so close to the Earth that it might create problems, like a star falling into the sea?
Actually, J.R., good question, because this is still an open topic. The orbit has not been closely enough refined yet. A comet's orbit is very oblique, and they haven't had time to get close readings on it. So its precise arrival time and its precise angular momentum is unknown. However, it could come closer to the Earth than, let's say, 1 AU, 1 astronomical unit, the distance from the Earth to the Sun. And if that happened, and if it fragmented due to its close distance to the Sun, if it began to fall apart, then the Earth could be bombarded with cometary particles. This has happened before in a minor way with Comet Swift-Tuttle, which did fragment and left particles in the Earth's orbit, which are still seen, by the way, from time to time entering the atmosphere as meteorites.
Now, you saw what happened to Jupiter last year.
Yes.
And this surely is not going to happen here, because in Psalm 96 he says, "Say among the Gentiles that the Lord reigneth, the world also shall be established, that it shall not be moved." In other words, everything's going to be all right. But this just precedes Psalm 97 that says, "A fire goeth before him and burneth up his enemies round about." There may be some fragments fall into the earth. We don't know the future. We can only speculate. But
it's possible, but
is,
this reference to fire could also have reference to a war. There have been wars proximate to comets in the past, and we could have
led to the Jewish rebellion. And during the year of the comet, it led to the Jewish rebellion against the Romans, didn't it?
Indeed, there was a war at that time. So, what we're talking about here are world-shattering political sea changes, huge changes. The idea of change, by the way, is seen here in the Psalms, J.R. We have a set of 7 Psalms, with Psalm 97 at the very center of them. And behind you, and in fact we might get the camera on you, and you can explain the menorah and the menorah design.
Yeah.
Because sets of 7 in Scripture conform to the Jewish menorah.
In Revelation chapter 1, Jesus is seen at the very introduction of the book of Revelation, standing in the midst of a 7 golden lampstand. As you see behind me, with the lights, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, and then the elevated servant lamp in the center, this appears to be not only what we have in Revelation 1, but in Psalms 94 through 100. And Psalm 97 then would be the 4th one in, which would be Psalm 94, 95, 96. 97 was right in the middle, and it's the one that says, "A fire goeth before him," and in verse 11, "Light is sown for the righteous."
Now, the servant candle is a very significant light. It's elevated above all the others. It's considered the master light. It is a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ as servant, and it is also a prophetic picture of the Son of Righteousness, because the Jewish word for servant lamp is shamash, which is very similar to the Hebrew word for son, shemesh. The Son of Righteousness comes with healing in his wings. The menorah is actually a prophetic picture of the coming of Christ. Christ is at the center of all the world's events. And the menorah, as pointed out by Jesus, even used to be thought of as representing the sun and planets.
And in Revelation chapter 1, when Jesus is introduced as the servant lamp standing in the middle of the menorah, John said that his countenance was as bright as the noonday sun, shining in its strength. So we're talking bright here.
We're talking bright. And in fact, if you read Psalm 97, it starts out, "The Lord reigneth, let the earth rejoice, let the multitude of the isles be glad thereof." And then what follows are a series of verses that use terms like fire, burning, lightnings, enlightening the world, light being sown for the righteous, supernatural displays of light. Now that is the servant lamp. That is the Lord doing something.
So we have a comet coming in this 1997. And we have in Psalm 96, the psalm that was used, as we said on our last program, to dedicate the Ark of the Covenant when it was brought to Jerusalem by David 3,000 years ago this year in 1996, this coming year. And so 96, 97, we've got the comet coming. Gary, it looks like these two psalms are just prophetic, absolutely incredible.
Now, this is accompanied by another fascinating fact. Structurally, the psalms that immediately surround Psalm 97 contain the phrase which we discussed on our last program. Psalm 96:13 has a sentence fragment that begins the actual verse. And that sentence fragment is, before the Lord. It's not a complete sentence. And if you look that up in the Hebrew language, that sentence fragment means in the very physical presence of the Lord. Now, that's got to be taken into consideration. But J.R., it's augmented by the fact that the psalm that follows Psalm 97, Psalm 98, has the same structure. The concluding verse of Psalm 98, namely verse 9, begins with a sentence fragment. The same sentence fragment, before the Lord, meaning in the very physical presence of the Lord. J.R., we have three psalms here. That's the center of the set of seven.
Yes.
96, 97, 98. And they all speak of the physical presence of the Lord. This is unprecedented in the Psalms.
Psalms 96 and 98 are a mirror image of themselves. They are almost identical, like the lamp on either side of Psalm 97, the servant lamp. And Gary, the phrase that follows that, before the Lord, or in the presence of His, in the face of His very presence, says, for he cometh. This is in verse 13 of Psalm 96. There are two of them here, referring to two comings. But when we get over to Psalm 98, it just says in the concluding verse, for he cometh, just one time.
One time.
Now, is it possible that He's coming twice? He's coming once to rapture the church. He's coming back 7 years later to conclude the revelation. And is it possible that His first coming is somewhere between verse 13 of Psalm 96 and verse 9 of Psalm 98, because by the time we get to Psalm 98, one of these, for he cometh, is gone?
Yes, indeed. And J.R., you know, I want to say something very quickly, which I had not planned to say. But when it comes to astronomical events, the Psalms speak volumes. Psalm 19 speaks of the Lord, the heavens declaring the glory of God, and this very, very interesting verse, verse 4, their line is gone out through the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them He set a tabernacle for the sun. 1919, Albert Einstein did set a tabernacle for the sun, took measurements that proved his theory of relativity, and the Psalms took note of that fact. A very interesting astronomical event is covered in Psalm 19. The year 1919, we have the same astronomical foreshadowing going on here in 1997.
Our book, Hidden Prophecies in the Psalms, is fabulous. We have documented year after year the fulfillment of each psalm of this century, and it's a part of the package on today's program that we're dealing with, and I hope you will avail yourself of it. Hidden Prophecies in the Psalms. Psalms 96, 97, and 98 are absolutely incredible when it comes to the possibilities of what could happen this next year. Gary, it says not only that light is sown for the righteous, but it says, and gladness for the upright in heart. Are those believers? Upright in heart?
Absolutely. The upright in heart are the righteous. And the word for gladness here in the Hebrew is simcha, which means great joy, almost dancing in the street, a giddy kind of joy. Well, this must mean that from the point of view of the righteous, some good things are going to be happening. Perhaps from the point of view of the enemies of God, things won't be so good.
Yeah. Now, we cannot tell you that a rapture is going to take place in 1996 or 1997 or when it is, because we are not date setters. But we sure have a neat verse right there. When this light of creation is sown, and the people that know God rejoice.